I structured the book geographically. I start with the northern mountains, then I go to the southern mountains, the northern mountains being from Sana up to Sada over to Mahwit, including Hara, Zamran, Jebel Milhan, etc. Then the southern mountains, Taiz, Ib, and then I go to the, what did I do next? Then I moved to Marib and El Beida, and then I come back and do the 3 mountain ranges near the Tihama coastal plain, Bora, Rema, and Wasab. And then I do the northern Tihama. That includes Edahi, Zaydiya, and then I do the southern Tihama, Beit el-Faqih, and Zbib. And then I move to the south, starting with Sayun, the largest city in the Hadramaut. And then I do 3 wadis, Ahmed, Wadi Duan, and Wadi Idam. And then I move down to the southern coast, Shihr, and then start going east, El Qusayr, still in the Hadramaut, and then I went to Mahra. And then I moved back a bit from Mahra is, of course, the governorate that borders Oman, that shared a language with the peoples of the Dhofar region, the Mahri language. And then I went back to the middle of the country, but the part that had been part of the south, Shebwa, and Dhala, and Yafa, and Lahij. And then at the end I thought, and where do I put Socotra? Socotra being small, but they still had their own jewelry. But it was tied to Shihr. They got their jewelry from Shihr, so I put it in that chapter. The book is called Silver Treasures from the Land of Sheba, Styles of Yemeni Regional Jewelry. It's a long title, but it's a book that covers perhaps 23 different styles of regional jewelry. And it will come out in October of 2013. Well, there are several things that are unique about Yemeni jewelry. And I have lived in other Arab countries, and I had looked at jewelry elsewhere. In Yemen, I found that there was more silver jewelry than in any other country I'd lived in. The amount is simply extraordinary. It was exported all across the Middle East. You'll find Yemeni jewelry in Morocco. In Egypt, I found a lot of pieces, and I bought some of my finest pieces in Damascus. Then there is the intricacy and the extraordinary variety. Each little region in Yemen had its own specific styles, and the silversmiths were scattered across the area. There were some remote areas that they would visit to sell, but they just lived in an extraordinary number of different places, meeting the needs of different customers. So the amount, the variety, the intricacy, the beauty, just unparalleled. In 1965, I married. In 1966, I went to Yemen with my husband, and we started looking at silver jewelry a bit together. But it was really in 1969 when we lived in Jeddah, the two of us, when we had more time on our hands and not a lot of distractions in Jeddah. There weren't a lot of things to do. We would go to the silver souk and interview silver dealers, and we discovered that the silversmiths were melting the old silver. People were bringing them old pieces. And so we started looking at the silver dealer's melting pot and found treasures, and that really gave us an impetus to start collecting old pieces. We felt as though we were saving them. In the north, and maybe it's the part of Yemen I know the best, since I lived in Sana'a more than in any other place in Yemen, there were Jewish silversmiths, and they developed a very intricate, labor-intensive type of jewelry. They excelled in filigree and granulation, and they developed within that. There were two silversmiths that led two different types of Yemeni Jewish jewelry. Harun Balsani excelled in very fine filigree, and Yahya Badihi, who had a large workshop in Sana'a and employed Muslim workers as well as Jewish, he excelled in granulation. But in one part of the lower mountains and all over the Tihama, you found pieces made by a silversmith named Ghadban. He is a Muslim silversmith. I never was able to get a lot of information about him, but I know his style very well. And it's, again, another whole distinctive, different type of jewelry. And then in Zabid, there was the Rafat family, and I found a member of the Rafat family to interview. And they excelled in certain kinds of bracelets. And then you had Adahi, which was a silver-making center where you had silversmiths excelling in certain types of jewelry. They also could copy other jewelry made by other silversmiths to meet the needs of specific customers. Then that's the jewelry in the northern part of Yemen. But in the southern part, it was originally under the British and only united with the North in 1990. You had a whole different silver tradition that perhaps was more influenced by Indian jewelry. They excelled in sizing, annealing, making beads. Their jewelry is stronger in design and very influenced by palm trees, which of course they always depended on for food, nourishment. Their gardens were full of palm trees. Then if you go east, you come to Mahra, which is up against the Omani border. And there they preferred gilded jewelry. Most of their jewelry was gilded, and it was gilded in a special way that was very gold intensive. So that's yet another distinctive style of jewelry in Yemen. And I'm always surprised. I've been studying this jewelry for many, many years, and I am always discovering pieces I'd never seen before. Well, I show in my book pictures of jewelry from the Sabaean period, the time of Queen of Sheba, dating from about the 6th century before Common Era. And those pieces show the two basic techniques of loop-in-loop chain and granulation. Well, there are many amulets to begin with that often held a verse from the Quran or a prayer from a holy man, and they were the cylinder shape, the kitab, was one that's called a hears, and then a second shape is a triangle, a muthalith. So that has the advantage of being able to hold a prayer, but also a triangle is a fertility symbol. And then the third is called a mahfaza. It's a big box that opens, that could hold a prayer, or it also, especially if it's a big box, it could hold money or even a marriage contract or important papers. But those were three basic shapes that were amuletic and also kind of practical. The jewelry was noisy, and that, in some cultures, supposedly chases away the evil spirit. The eye appeared in those bracelets from Wadi Duan. That was not a frequent symbol, but I documented that was the meaning there in Wadi Duan. When coins were used in jewelry, and they often were, that was to represent prosperity, to show that the family was of a good financial position, and also the jewelry showed that the husband cared especially about his wife. And of course you have the crescent shape that represents the moon. That's an Islamic symbol. You have the sun, which again would represent prosperity. You sometimes had a fish shape, and a snake. They both are positive symbols symbolizing fertility. Many of the Jewish silversmiths made those very intricate mulberry beads, and they signed them. But then they would be composed in a necklace. They would be the spacer beads, and they would fit right over beads, often of black coral or of regular pink coral, or even of amber beads. So you couldn't see the signature, but they're very beautiful. The Kisra is I was very surprised to find this necklace in Hadramaut because it's a very strange shape. It looks a bit like a bird, and it's something that married women wear every day. It has to be part of their group of necklaces, especially in the Sayun, Shibam area of the northern Hadramaut. I never could get more detail than that. No one seemed to know where the original idea came from. Well, this piece is from Sheher, and these two shaped beads always appeared together. These were called wusha, this distinctive flat bead with these round circles on it. And next to it you have beads of wrapped wire called dis. Both these beads are difficult to make and aren't made anymore. And they were made only in Sheher, where there were several silversmiths working. That's something I really haven't figured out. Many of the Jewish silversmiths did sign their names. Not all of them. I was told that in that case, it would have been a silversmith whose style was so immediately recognizable he wouldn't need to sign it. I also was told that often customers did not want their jewelry signed because they were afraid that other people who saw it would go to the same maker and copy their special piece. In the south, in Sheher, the Amaris signed their silver and date it. But in the north, the Muslim silversmiths almost never signed. And of course, among the new silversmiths, I was told that in many cases, if they were selling to a middleman, the middleman would not want it signed because he would like to be able to sell it as an old piece and perhaps get more money. What I call the Rujum group, the silversmiths from Rujum. The one that I probably knew the best when I was there was Ali Mutahar. I spent, maybe 2 or 3 hours interviewing him in his tiny workshop near the Citadel. He started doing silver when he was 20 or 21. Or he was 21 when I interviewed him. He had started several years ago. He excels in granulation and filigree, and has a very creative eye. He copies very well, but he also has made some new designs of his own that are really very beautiful. Bakil is one of the silversmiths who has a workshop and includes his brothers in it. He has at least 2 brothers, maybe 3, who also do silver. And he's very talented. He stopped making silver for a while to focus on marketing for his family. The last I knew of him, he was back again doing silver himself. Muhammad Nasr is one of the most talented of this group. He did a variety of very fine pieces, including some complicated bead necklaces, which are very challenging. I spent some time sitting with him. He had a small workshop in the Old City where he worked by himself in a very quiet atmosphere and just produced one beautiful piece after another. Mohammed Ghamoush is an older silversmith. He probably is in his 60s. And when he was young, he excelled in making what they call sha'iri beads or barley beads. But later in his life, he found that he didn't have any customers for that kind of bead anymore. And so he created a modern-looking link bracelet with little barley pieces soldered on top for design, and developed quite a clientele among the Swedish visitors to the Old City. Oh, this was one of the most fantastic surprises I experienced. I went to interview Mr. Ekwai in his home. He was very gracious, received me beautifully, and I must have spent 2 or 3 hours with him talking about the tradition of Muslim silversmiths making this specific type of jambia case, which involves niello and gilding and cutout work. It's very intricate, very beautiful work. And a day later, or maybe a few days later, the silver dealer who had made this contact for me said that he had sent me a present, and I opened it and found to my absolute amazement that he had made me a facsimile of Martha and George Washington, and to this day I don't know where he found their pictures and where he got this inspiration, but I was extremely touched. Other silversmiths have been very generous, but no one has ever sat and created such a special, rare gift. And in his case, it was the first time he had ever made a piece for a woman. He started in ties, and again, I'm not sure where he got his inspiration for this, but he started using a lost wax method of casting to make jewelry that replicates the old silver jewelry, but in a much faster and less expensive technique. It's still difficult to do, but much easier and less time-consuming. One thing that he did was produce these cutout beads that are an exact replica of beads made in Zaydiya, this town in the Tihama that has a unique style of open work jewelry. And I was deceived the first time, or confused, or I did not recognize that the beads were cast. I thought they were made by hand, and he was very pleased that I had made that mistake because it testifies to the quality of his work. The shagger are those wonderful pieces that hang over the ears, but they hang from the turban that the woman wears around her head. They are very sharp, and it's a thick wire that holds a whole variety of decoration down below. Some of them have dangles and make a lot of noise. Some are I think the pieces that I showed you are from Haraz, and they're finer and more distinctive. But shagger come in all kinds of shapes. That Balsani bracelet, I believe, as best I can calculate, was made in Ib. Ib again had some, I assume that they were Jewish silversmiths. I don't have the clearest documentation, but I think they were. And they produced some very special bracelets, each very different from the other, but they just have a character that makes them different from the jewelry of Taiz or Sana, the other two big centers in the Ba. Bora is one of those mountain ranges that rises up out of the Tihama. It's very near the coastal plain, and it was famous for coffee. It still has a lot of coffee. And the mountains are very high there, and in a town called Rukab, on the very crest of the highest mountain peak, is where 5 Jewish families did silversmithing. And I went there to interview. There also was a silver dealer from that area who brought a lot of pieces of jewelry made by them. So I could study a lot of different pieces, from belts to mashagger to rings to fabulous necklaces. Some gilded, some not. Very, very exciting jewelry, and again, quite varied, but still distinctively from there. Well, I was pleased to learn, but it distressed me how long it took me to figure this out. Men don't, well, it's hard to find out what the real role of women is in silver making. The women were very important in making mesh loop-and-loop belts in the Hadramaut, very intricate work. They do it with a crochet hook. There's no soldering involved, so they could do it without having to handle soldering. In the north, they also did, and still do. I met the husband of a woman who does the mesh belt that they then put the very fancy Balsani type shapes on it. And she was in Jeddah at the time, so I couldn't interview her, and I never got back to meet with her, but I photographed her work. Then I learned in Sana, again kind of accidentally, that the wife of one silversmith, an important silversmith in Sana, he would do the granules. He would make all the granules, and he would anneal a basic shape, say the cylinder shape, the kitab shape, and he would leave all the little granules in some kind of container, and then his wife would sit there and do the design. And in my book I have an extraordinarily beautiful, intricate kitab with this design that the wife did. He came and soldered it at night, but the artistic contribution in that piece was that of his wife. Well, Abdallah Ghalib, I went to Wasab. I had heard, before I went to Wasab, I had very little hard facts, very few facts. I was told that they were famous for making mulberry beads, toot, they're called in Arabic. And I was told that there had been a lot of silversmiths there. Nobody knew if there still were. So I went first to the high part of the Wasab. It's divided into two. You have Wasab, the high Wasab, Wasab Ali, and you have Wasab Safal. But I went to the high part first, and they had Jewish silversmiths, and so they had no more silversmiths, but they sent me down to Wasab Safal, Low Safal. And as we just kept asking directions, and we were sent to a town called Arifa, which is where the Arifis are from. And it turns out the Arifis are the largest silver-making family in the northern part of Yemen. And we were sent, finally, once we got there and kept asking, we ended up at this workshop where these two brothers were working silver, Abdullah and Ghalib, and his brother Mohammed bin Ghalib. And I pulled out, I always traveled with a huge notebook full of pictures of jewelry from the region. It was a fantastic way to interview. And as I was leafing through, Abdullah grabbed one picture and he said, "I made that." And I was flabbergasted. When I did my first jewelry exhibit in 2002 at the Bead Museum, we dressed a head as a Yemeni bride, and we used his headpiece as the basis for the whole outfit. And there he was. But he didn't, both he and his brother just use Ghalib, and they don't use Al-Arifi. You know, in Yemen, you really have to ask and ask if you want to get a person's final name. So he and his brother were in this remote location. They're both in their late 60s, early 70s. They were reduced to making the lips for jambiyas. And Abdullah Ghalib brought out a jambiya case that he had made in filigree and granulation. Honestly, as good as any Balsami work. He said if he sold that piece, he wouldn't make enough money to make it pay. He said the maximum he could get for something like that he worked on for at least a week was $80. And all the money would go to the dealer who was selling it, the middleman. Oh, well, I recommend that they go to the silver market and go from store to store and look. I have 2 consultants for my book, and I don't hesitate to mention them as good sources. In Sana'a, it's Kamal Rubeih from the World Friend Shop in the heart of the Silver Souk in the Old City. In Sayoun, my consultant is Hassan Bahashwan, who has a shop in the museum in Sayoun. A silver dealer I knew in the Hadramaut, to gain entry to homes in the Hadramaut, he told me I had to come by myself, that I couldn't come with a Yemeni helper. I really needed to do this by myself. And so that got me off with some fear and trepidation. But what I discovered right away was, only one silversmith that I interviewed out of about 43 had ever been asked anything about his work by anybody. So the silversmiths were thrilled to talk about their work. They were very flattered. And I found the same was true of the women who wore it. So it was easy for me to gather information. And I will describe one encounter I had in a home in the Hadramaut. I was meeting with a group of women, and as I pulled out my big notebook full of pictures of Hadrami silver, the older women in the room became very excited. They'd never talked about it. And the hostess put on a wedding dress, and she put on a couple of wedding belts, and she started dancing around the room, the same dance that she would have done when she married. And the older women in the room started dancing in rhythm with her. The excitement was palpable in the room. And I stepped out of the room because I was being called to meet with someone else, somewhere else in the building. And the woman's daughter followed me out. She was marriageable age, so she was veiled even among women. She lifted her veil and looked at me and said with great excitement that she had never seen her mother's wedding dress. She had never seen this jewelry nor heard these stories, and she loved it. That to me was a very exciting encounter.